Coming to you live from Silicon Valley. This is Louis Lowe. I'm a corporate partner from Foley Lardner, and I am delighted to host this short podcast on President Trump's America First investment policy. Today is Friday, April the 4th, and HK and Christopher, so glad to have you with us. HK, please introduce yourself.
Sure. HK Park. I work for a corporate intelligence firm based here in Washington, formerly with the Pentagon.
And I'm Christopher Swift, partner at Foley and Lardner, former Treasury Department, former White House.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much. And again, today we're going to talk about President Trump's America First investment policy. And specifically, we're going to try and leave our directors, who are our targeted audience today, some takeaways on both the strategic challenges presented and practical insights in interpreting this thing. So taking it from the top, on February 21st, 2025, the Trump administration issued a presidential memorandum establishing the parameters for a new America First investment policy. And against the backdrop of high tariffs, escalating trade wars, and aggressive immigration enforcement, this specific memorandum underscores the administration's efforts to fundamentally transform the movement of capital, goods, and people across international borders. And it signals new challenges for corporate directors, guiding corporate organizations through a period of both economic and geopolitical change. And so today we're going to try and hit 5 specific areas for our directors. One is what to expect in terms of changes to the CFIUS foreign investment review process. 2, what are the potential restrictions on outbound U.S. investment in high-risk countries? 3, what is the heightened scrutiny to be expected for investments involving AI and quantum compute? 4th, what are the practical implications on M&A transactions with China, East Asia, Europe, and other participations in the global economy? And lastly, strategies to adapt to the changing environment. So without further ado, Christopher, I want to turn to you first and ask you to kind of give us the highlights of this presidential memorandum. What does it say about the Trump administration's America First approach to cross-border investment?
Happy to do it, Louis. So the most important thing to note about this presidential memorandum is it is a framework document. It's aspirational. It's not an implementing document. But right now, the agencies that comprise the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and major U.S. intelligence agencies, including the Office of Director of National Intelligence and the FBI, are reevaluating how the CFIUS process works and trying to align that CFIUS process to some of the aspirations we see set forth in this presidential memorandum. Summarizing really briefly, there's a desire to streamline approval processes for some parties. There's a desire to make things a little less burdensome for passive investors. But at the same time, there is a very aggressive approach towards investment from China or parties that are adjacent to China. And that's consistent with what we saw in Project 2025, and Agenda 47. Now we're seeing it start to be implemented.
And Christopher, are we talking about how to evaluate investment in a U.S. corporation that's coming into the U.S. from China or some other country? Or are we talking about outbound investment where a U.S. corporation builds a plant in China?
Well, we're likely to see both eventually wrapped into this, but if you look at the presidential memorandum, Louis, it's primarily focused on using national security authorities at CFIUS and also the same national security authorities that we've seen used to implement very, very high tariffs in recent days to sort of reshape that global landscape that you were talking about. And if you look at the administration's priorities, it's really to reduce the burdens on folks that they think are winning investors, while increasing the burdens on PRC-affiliated investors that might be doing anything involving critical technology, healthcare, agriculture, energy, raw materials, or other strategic sectors. So you're going to see an expansion of those strategic sectors that'll have higher scrutiny, more focus on China, but perhaps an easing of CFIUS-related restrictions on the winners that the administration perceives.
Well, before I ask you who are those winners, what is specifically going to change in terms of CFIUS process? And again, for everyone's benefit, CFIUS is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's an interagency group of senior government regulators from across the administration, and they review currently any inbound investment that comes into the United States from a foreign country. And now I guess that's going to change. And so specifically, Christopher, tell us what's going to change in terms of CFIUS review process.
Well, that I have to pull out my crystal ball a little bit, but between now and late May, early June, we don't anticipate much is going to change. Circa late May or early June, the administration will probably propose an update to the CFIUS regulations that align with the priorities that we see in this memorandum. Personally, I'm expecting to see areas like sensitive personal data, healthcare, biotech, certain categories of high tech, agricultural land and other areas become mandatory filings as opposed to voluntary. But I think that will be tied toward high threat countries rather than just any country's investor.
Christopher, if I'm a director of a company that's considering taking an investment from an investor outside the United States, what should I be thinking about after I read this memo?
Yeah, so three things. The first is, does the company that on whose board you serve, do they have a good way for managing the CFIUS process as it currently exists? The second is, are they ready for an expansion of the zone of filings that could become mandatory, or have they been assuming that their particular sector would never be relevant? We see that a lot in healthcare and biotech, where folks just assumed that their area wouldn't matter. Same for agricultural and real estate transactions. And then the third question, Louis, would really be, how much exposure do they have to high-risk countries? Obviously, nobody's going to be taking investment from North Korea or Iran, but increasingly the US government is going to be locking down on China for both inbound investment and outbound investment. And it's going to be very, very important to keep a close eye on both active and passive investment from China, and also investment from parties that are adjacent to China.
Very helpful. HK, could you help me understand these changes that impact outbound investment from the United States into other countries, including China? I think many of our directors sit on boards that make significant investment or have plants already in places like China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. If we want to make new investments in those plants or acquire land or make an investment in a company there, what should we be thinking about, and what should we expect?
Sure. So the memorandum proposes to make changes to the 2024 Biden rule restricting investment in China, not other countries, China, and specifically in three sectors: AI, quantum, and semiconductors. The memo proposes to expand those sectors to include biotech, hypersonics, aerospace, advanced manufacturing, and directed energy. In addition, it proposes going beyond just the active investors, the venture capital firms, to include potentially limited partners, greenfield investment in China, as well as corporate expansions in China.
That's a heavy load, HK. What practical steps should directors ask their management teams to consider if they have operations in China and are working in one of these targeted sectors?
So I recommend that they request an audit of the proposed investments in China or proposed corporate expansions in China to understand what the company is proposing in that country from a national security perspective, right? And that includes not just corporate expansions, but what is the corporate venture capital arm of the company doing? Does the company have an employee pension plan that's invested in China, or maybe a company foundation that's active in China as well?
And any changes needed to their already existing compliance programs to avoid criminal or civil penalties or potential reputational risk?
For the current memo, no, since the memo, as Chris mentioned, is aspirational, but they should have a compliance program already in place for the 2024 Biden outbound investment screening rule.
HK, you talked about corporate venture capital divisions of these corporations. Are there other categories of investors that need to watch out?
So the memo mentions other types of LPs that were essentially excluded from the Biden rule. They include pensions, foundations, and endowments too.
Christopher, I want to turn back to you. How should companies be preparing for these challenges?
Well, some of the things that HK just described are absolutely necessary. We strongly recommend conducting audits, doing a global risk assessment to figure out where your investment is coming from, where your investment is going, and the risks associated with those countries, not just with those countries, but also with the parties in question. It's also really important to understand what your company is doing, right? You may not realize, because the focus traditionally has been on aerospace and defense and maybe critical infrastructure related to homeland security, that developing a new vaccine is now seen as a potential national security event. That in collecting human clinical trial data is a potential national security event. That even starting a greenfield corporation, within 20 miles of a military installation in the United States might be seen as a potential national security event. So if you're not doing that risk mapping, if you don't understand what the company is doing internally and how the company orients itself to the world, you're really not in a good position to manage where we are now, and more importantly, what's coming next. If I were a director, corporate director, I'd want to make sure that the legal department in the corporation I'm advising and the leadership team in the corporation I'm advising are taking a proactive approach to these issues rather than a reactive transaction-based approach.
And HK, what other questions should directors be asking?
One thing to think about is what happens next, right? So you mentioned the initial tariffs and China's reaction. If this spirals out of control into a larger trade war between the U.S. and China, what more could happen between the U.S. and China, in particular for U.S. companies operating in China? So are they reviewing all the links to China, whether supplier, customer, JV partners, local employees in China, to prepare for perhaps a worst-case scenario where you have potentially a Chinese action against Taiwan, similar to Russia against Ukraine several years ago, which forced many U.S. companies to quickly and retroactively shut down all their relationships in a certain country.
Christopher, any additional observations or recommendations before we close?
Sure. Let's just pull out and look at the big picture. Sometimes as corporate directors, it's really important to have a sense of where the world is heading and not just where a particular transaction is heading. As evident from this presidential memorandum and from the tariff actions that the president has taken in recent days, the Trump administration sees absolutely no difference between national security and economic security, and their particular vision of security reflects a desire to return to the high tariff, low investment environment that we saw between the First World War and the Second World War. So the most important contributions that directors can make, in my opinion, at this time, is to make sure that corporations are being proactive, that they have proactive strategies for evaluating and adapting to these political and economic shifts. If you're not driving the bus in this particular environment, you will get run over it. And it doesn't matter whether it's tariffs, trade, or foreign direct investment.
Thank you so much, Christopher and HK. Directors, I hope this was an informative first introduction to President Trump's America First investment policy. Trust us to come back to you when implementing regulations from this policy come out, which, as Christopher mentioned, we expect sometime in the late spring. Thanks for joining.